Hi everybody, and welcome to this video which goes through obedience with a particular focus on the Milgram obedience experiments. This is part of the social influence topic for Stage 2 psychology. Let's get started. Let's first define what obedience actually means. Obedience is a form of social influence that involves performing an action under the orders of an authority figure. This differs from compliance and conformity. Compliance involves changing our behavior at the request of another person, but not an authority figure, whereas conformity involves altering our behavior to go along with the majority group. We go through compliance and conformity in much more detail later on in this course. But back to obedience. Research on obedience came from the need to understand situations whereby people would suspend their own moral judgments to carry out an order from someone they considered to be an authority figure. There are many examples of obedience in society. So parents, armed forces and bosses, teachers, police officers, government officials, the list goes on. So the most famous psychological study of obedience is that of Stanley Milgram, pictured here. He wanted to understand why so many German people obeyed Hitler in his orders to exterminate the Jews during the 1930s and 40s during World War II. He wanted to find out if obedience had a significant impact on a range of people of varying demographics. His research was published only 6 months after the execution of Adolf Eichmann for his part of the Holocaust. At his trial, Eichmann claimed that he was only obeying orders. Eichmann, pictured here at his trial, was hanged for his part in the final solution in 1962. So let's go through the actual experiment itself. The aim was to see how obedient participants would be in a situation where obeying orders would mean breaking their own moral code and hurting an innocent person. There were many replications and variations done of Milgram's experiments, but for the first trials, 40 men aged between 20 and 50 were recruited by an advertisement, pictured here. This was via newspaper. They were told they were taking part in a learning experiment about the effects of punishment on learning, which is of course false. They were then introduced to Mr. Wallace, apparently another participant, but Mr. Wallace was actually a Confederate working with Milgram and was in on the experiment. Participants drew straws to determine the role of either learner or teacher. However, Milgram ensured that the real participant was always the teacher, and the Confederate, Mr. Wallace, was always the learner. So even though it appeared random, it was always rigged. Mr. Wallace was then strapped into a chair behind a screen and connected to a shock generator, as you can see here. The genuine participant tested Wallace on his memory for word pairs. The experimenter, pictured here, who usually wore a grey lab coat, ordered the participant, teacher, to flick a switch to administer an electric shock to Mr. Wallace each time he answered a question wrong, or if he did not provide an answer at all. The volts increased by 15 volts each time, up to a lethal 450 volts. As the level of shocks increased, Mr. Wallace cried out and begged to be released. At 300 volts, Mr. Wallace would go silent, apart from the occasional knocking on the screen from the next room. When participants protested at having to continue shocking him, the experimenter gave them verbal orders, or prods, in a sequential order. Please continue. The experiment requires that you continue. It is absolutely essential that you continue. You have no other choice but to continue. Now, unknown to the participants, there were no real shocks being delivered, and the cries that they heard were being played via a music projector. So the genuine participants believed that they were administering shocks when in fact they weren't. The only genuine shock that was actually done was a trial shock before the experiment started. The genuine participant was given a 45-volt shock, so they then couldn't plead ignorance to not knowing how powerful the shocks were later on. The percentage of participants who gave different voltages was measured, and the reactions of the participants were observed. The results were extremely surprising to both Milgram, his team, and eventually the public. 65%, or 2/3 of participants, being the teachers, the genuine participants, continued to the highest level of 450 volts. 100% of the participants continued to at least 300 volts. Prior to the experiment, it was predicted that no participants would go to 450 volts and that only about 4% would go to 300 volts. Milgram concluded that humans have a very strong tendency to obey orders, even when these goes against their own morals. The Milgram experiment has been replicated many times with several variations, including being in the same room, physically placing the learner's hand on an electric plate, no screaming but only banging from the separate room, female participants, and a different setting. The results were all very similar. However, we do go through each of these independent variables in more detail later on in this video. This means that many crimes against humanity may be the outcome of situational factors rather than dispositional factors. So dispositional factors are internal factors and personal qualities of a person. This can include genetics, personality traits, intelligence, self-esteem, etc. So they relate to a person's disposition, hence the term. Whereas situational factors are elements in the environment that influence behavior, so someone's work, school environment, and of course the others around us. This very much relates to the social factor in the biopsychosocial model as well. Now we should talk about the other factors that influence the Milgram experiment results. As I said before, this is one of the most replicated experiments in psychology's history, and Milgram introduced a round of variations to see if it would have a profound impact on the results. One of these is the status of the location. So the orders were initially given in an important location, being Yale University. However, when Milgram's study was conducted in a rundown office in the city, obedience levels dropped. So this may suggest that prestige increases obedience. Personal responsibility is also a factor. When there is less personal responsibility, obedience increases. So, when participants could instruct an assistant to press the switches, 95% compared to 65% in the original study, chopped to the maximum 450 volts. This relates to Milgram's agency theory, which we'll talk about later. But that is a significant increase, almost 100%, because the responsibility was diffused or not put on that genuine participant, and that increases obedience dramatically. The legitimacy of the authority figure is also a massive factor, as we can see here. People tend to obey orders from other people if they recognize the authority as morally right and or legally based. This response to legitimate authority is learned in a variety of situations, for example, in the family, school, and workplace. So what this means is that if the authority figure is perceived as legitimate, as being morally correct, or have a legal standing, obedience is going to increase significantly. Prestige or status of the authority figure is also a factor. Milgram's experimenter wore a lab coat, which is a symbol of scientific expertise, which gave him high status. But when the experimenter dressed in everyday clothes, obedience was very low. So the uniform of the authority figure can give them status. Clothing is important, and it has a lot of power. That's why a lot of authority figures have a uniform, because it increases obedience levels. Higher levels of perceived prestige and closer proximity to the authority figure are also associated with increased obedience. So what this means is when participants were in very close proximity or sat very close to the authority figure, it increased obedience levels. Peer support was another variation introduced by Milgram. If a person has the social support of their friends, then obedience is less likely. This is also referred to as presence of an ally. So the presence of others who are seen to disobey the authority figure reduces the level of obedience also. This happened in Milgram's experiment. When there was a disobedient model being observed, genuine participants were then far less likely to obey the authority figure based on what they had observed. Proximity to the authority figure I've already briefly covered, but Milgram did several variations of this. It is easier to resist the orders from an authority figure if they are not close by. So when the experimenter instructed and prompted the teacher by telephone from another room, obedience plummeted to 20.5%. So when the authority figure is close by, then obedience is far more likely. We also need to talk about de-individuation. It's exactly what the word sounds like, losing your individuality, your ability to think and make decisions for yourself, and instead going along with the group's behavior. This also is very, very prevalent in conformity, which we're going to talk about later in another video. Instead of acting as individuals, people experiencing de-individuation become lost in a group. This often means that they will go along with whatever the group is doing, whether it be rioting, looting, as it is seen so often when there is civil unrest and protests, or engaging in cyberbullying, whereby individuals like or comment on a post because everyone else is doing it. The psychology of this behavior may be because individuals experience a sense of anonymity in a group. The larger the group, the higher the incidences of de-individuation. This occurs when people are moved by the group experience to do things that, without the group for support, they would not normally do. De-individuation and a lack of expertise in participants were also associated with higher levels of obedience. Now, gender was also examined. Milgram did later on, as I said before, bring in female participants to see if gender affected the results. Although women reported higher levels of stress than men, women obeyed fully with the experimenter's commands 65% of the time, identical to male participants. And based on replications of the experiment worldwide using both male and female participants, all but one study found no male or female differences at all. Different cultures have been adopted as part of this Milgram study as well, which means that several cultures have replicated this experiment to see if culture influences the results. Various replications of the experiment have identified cultural differences in obedience rates. So it's been concluded that culture plays a significant role in our behavior, especially when comparing individualist and collectivist cultures. Here is a graph where we can see the authors of the studies replicating the original Milgram experiment, the country rate in percent, and the obedience levels. We can see that there is a significant difference between some cultures and their levels of obedience. Milgram's obedience experiments have been heavily criticized for the questionable ethics throughout the whole procedure. So Milgram conducted a follow-up questionnaire which indicated that the majority of participants were glad that they participated and had learned something important from the experiment. Current ethical principles do not allow Milgram's experiment to be conducted anymore. However, the main ethical criticisms that the experiment receives are these three here: psychological harm and distress, right to withdraw, and deception. Psychological harm and distress, sometimes this is called general well-being, both are correct. Critics argue that Milgram's study placed his participants under significant emotional strain, causing psychological damage to them that might not be justified. Several participants had marks on their hands from digging their nails in discomfort. Others were visibly sweating and trembling, with 3 participants having been reported as having seizures. Right to withdraw. Milgram informed his participants at the beginning of the study that they could withdraw at any stage, and this would not compromise the financial incentive that was offered to participate. However, during the experiment, when participants indicated that they did not wish to continue in their role, the experimenter responded with the following prompts: please continue, the research requires you continue, it is essential that you continue, and you must go on. If they were allowed to withdraw immediately, then it would defeat the purpose of doing the experiment in the first place. So while it was necessary for validity, it was highly unethical based on the right to withdraw. And we know that the participants were deceived. Milgram informed his participants that they each had a chance of being the teacher or the learner. However, Milgram had organised a selection process which guaranteed the true participant was always the teacher. Milgram also stated that the aim of the study was regarding the role of punishment and learning rather than obedience to authority. If he had been truthful, obviously the internal validity wouldn't have been high, and the results could not be generalised. Participants were made to believe that they were administering electric shocks to another person, when in fact they weren't. So all of this falls under the ethical dilemma of deception. Milgram's study is also criticized for various other lack of ecological validity, especially in today's world. However, it's praised for internal validity because he was able to get rid of a lot of extraneous variables and make correlations between obedience to authority and the several variations that he introduced. That's it for this video. I hope you found that informative and useful for revision. Any questions, as always, let me know.